Hello, and welcome to our Lichen Lecture. My name is Stowe Tatey, and I'm the Managing Editor of Pediatric Ethoscope, and I'd like to announce the winners of this year's essay contest. We have a tie this year with Marcella Monti and Meg Menzel. Are you here? There is a sign-up sheet in the back for people who are interested in receiving Pediatric Ethoscope.
Hello, I'm Thomas Silver. I'm the director of the Pediatric Ethics Program. It's a delight to introduce Ethics Day. We're going to have a very special speaker today. And we start with our pediatric grand rounds, the Liking Lecture. There are very few left here that knew Dr. Liking. Dr. Liking did his pediatric residency here at Children's Hospital and was active in many departments, pathology, neonatology, and he landed in hematology, oncology, and labored there for many years, becoming the chair of that division. And around the last 10 years of his career, he became very intrigued with issues of ethics. And we were together at the Kennedy Center for Bioethics studying, and he graduated there and became a prolific writer also in the field of ethics. And in a way, one of the pioneers of pediatric ethics. So his family, honoring his lifetime work, endowed this lecture. So our guest today is somebody very, very dear to us. Dr. Yoram Unguru did his fellowship in hematology oncology here at Children's Hospital, the same place as Dr. Liking, and graduated from there 8 years ago. He, at that time, was also a winner of the Pediatric Ethoscope essay, which is work, which is really a work that has been quoted everywhere on ascent of adolescence. Dr. Unguru actually trained in Israel at Technion, where he received his MD. He did the residency at the Sinai Division at Children's Hospital, Sinai, and he's currently there at the Sinai Division of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology. He is also a member there of the Berman Institute of Bioethics with Johns Hopkins University, one of the most prestigious centers in this field. He has published in this field, and on a note of interest, he has many other qualities. He worked his way through medical school as a tennis instructor. That's still his passion. And he was a drill sergeant in the parachute unit of the Israeli army. So there are many things. Last night we invited him to a dinner. There were many things we talked about. But today he's going to talk about a very serious issue, which is shortage of drugs, surpluses of ethical challenges, an allocation framework for childhood cancer. Thank you. Welcome.
Morning. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So I'd like to thank the nominating committee and Thomas, my mentor, my friend and colleague, for inviting me today. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, and I look forward to today's events. when I got my start thinking about where I wanted to do HEMONC training, I knew that I'd get excellent training no matter where I went, but I was looking for a place that would support my research interests in bioethics. And it may come as a surprise to folks here at an institution that values bioethics, but I got quite a few frowns from programs and fellowship directors when they said, you don't want to go to the lab? You want to study bioethics? Needless to say, that wasn't the case here, and I don't know if Mike Guerrera is here or not, but he was my program director, and when I came to interview, he arranged this impromptu meeting with Tomas and another member, Andy, of the ethics committee, who I don't think is here anymore, and I was the first one who kind of did bioethics here, but that didn't sway anybody within HEMONC, and they were willing to support that, and they worked with me, and the rest is history, and for that I'm forever grateful. And as I got my feet wet in pediatric bioethics here at Children's, I didn't know who Dr. Lycan was, but as I started working on issues of assent, his name kept popping up. And as Dr. Silber said, he was a real leader in pediatric bioethics, and he was one of the first people, probably the first person who seriously spoke about this idea of including kids in decisions about their care, listening to them, and that we all know is commonplace now, but he was a real leader in that way. And so I think it's only appropriate that my first real foray into pediatric bioethics focused on the same areas. So I'm grateful. It's a special honor to be here, and it's not lost on me. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, for the last few years, I've been involved with drug shortages, both as a clinician, like you all, and as a member of the Children's Oncology Group Steering Committee on Bioethics. And needless to say, not something that I thought I'd ever have to deal with. And so in the time that we have, I'll give some background about the shortages, talk about some of the unique ethical issues they raise for clinicians and institutions, and then I'll tell you about what efforts that colleagues and I within COG have been working on. And then we're going to try something a little different. I have candy up here, okay? That candy is meant for people who are willing to speak up and not be afraid. Because we're going to try, I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to come up with your own allocation schema for scarce life-saving chemo for kids with cancer, and then we'll compare it to what the COG task force I've shared has done, and then we'll see which one we like better. So unlike these fine folks, I have no disclosures, and you get extra points if, who knows who the top guy on the left is? No, that's Ben Johnson from Canada in the 1980s. I'm keeping the candy. Hopefully you guys will warm up. So here are the objectives for today. So if only it were this easy, right? So for those of you who can't see the caricature, it's a doctor speaking to his patient and says, there's a drug shortage, I'm thinking of replacing your meds with 8 hugs a day before and after meals. So although our focus today on chemotherapy shortages of medications and other essential resources have a long-standing history. One of the first large-scale drug shortages was insulin in the 1920s, and this was followed by shortages of penicillin in the 1940s that affected far greater numbers of patients. And both the insulin and penicillin shortages were due to an inability to manufacture adequate supply. And they offer very important lessons for us as we think about shortages today, something that is important to keep in mind. Now, at the time of the penicillin shortages, it was preferentially allocated to U.S. soldiers and not civilians, and this was done without public comment. And this caused a huge outcry. Again, something to keep in mind as we think about things today. At the same time that there were shortages of penicillin, there were food shortages on the U.S. home front in the Second World War. Fast forward to the 1960s, some of you with more gray hair than others may recall there were shortages of dialysis machines, and here the limited constraint was money. And there was a 7-member panel that was called the Seattle God Committee, or God Squad, and this was the group of individuals who decided who would get dialysis and who wouldn't. And in addition to focusing on factors like health and prognosis, they focused on social worth. So people who went to church got dialysis, people who didn't, maybe not, people who were married over people who were single. Again, something to think about as we cope with these shortages today. I remember in the 1970s standing in line to get gasoline. There was a shortage of that. And then more recently, we've had shortages of H1N1 influenza vaccine, seasonal influenza vaccine. Perhaps the most obvious shortage that we probably can think about are organs. I mean, there's over 120,000 people here in the States who are waiting for an organ at any given time. I don't know what it's like here in D.C., but I can tell you in Maryland, it seems like there's always a shortage of nurses. We just can't have enough nurses to work. Does anybody recognize this, what this building is? And I realize it may not project. That's Memorial Hospital in New Orleans during Katrina. So finding people who are willing to work during a natural disaster like a hurricane or an Ebola outbreak is difficult. And then we have shortages, of course, of ventilators, vaccine, antivirals, ECMO units, drugs. So when it comes to chemotherapy, though, it's important to keep the following in mind. Shortages have gone on for the past decades, but over the past 10-plus years, they've become increasingly more common, and this includes chemotherapeutics. And this is primarily a U.S. problem. It doesn't tend to happen nearly to the same degree in other countries as it does here. And I think Michael Link captured this most aptly. And for those of you who don't know who Michael is, he's a pediatric oncologist at Stanford and a recent past president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And here's what he says. Although we've had shortages before, they've never lasted as long nor involved as many drugs as they do now. So presently, there's about 200 drugs in short supply in the U.S. Let me repeat that for effect. There's about 200 drugs in short supply in the U.S. And there's two sources you can get up-to-date info, the FDA and the American Society of Health Systems Pharmacists. But our focus today is really going to be on the chemotherapy and supportive care drugs. So when it comes to these chemotherapy shortages, most of the drugs belong to this class of older, sterile, generic injectables. In fact, when you look at all drugs on the U.S. short list, not just chemotherapeutics, up to 75% belong to these injectable classes. And it's critical to appreciate that these injectables, they make up the backbone of proven and life-saving regimens, not just for kids with cancer, but for adults with cancer as well. And because so many of the drugs that we rely upon in oncology belong to this class of drugs, it seems as though we're particularly susceptible to them. Now, this next group of slides is courtesy of a colleague of mine, Erin Fox, at the University of Utah Drug Information Service, and I want to thank her for sharing them with me. So what you see here, the data that you see is the number of new drug shortages each year in the United States beginning in 2001. And you'll see 2011 was the first time in 5 years that a new record wasn't set. But I'd argue with still somewhere between 100 and 200 new shortages each year, something has to give. And take a look at the first quarter of this year. There's already been almost 50 new drugs in short supply. And see how timely this data is. It's not even 2 weeks old. Here are the number of active drug shortages per quarter. So although there have been fewer new shortages each year, our inability to resolve existing shortages is why we still have, right now, here's where I got that number, nearly 200 drugs in short supply. Now this slide is probably one of the most important I'm going to show you. Yes, you can see that there's currently 16 chemotherapeutics in short supply, but really I think the take-home is it doesn't matter what kind of a patient or doctor you are, you're going to be impacted by these shortages that include not just chemo, but antivirals, antibiotics, critical care drugs, essential electrolytes and minerals, normal saline. Last I checked, that was salt water. So while the reasons for the shortage are multifactorial, most experts agree that the primary causes are economic, manufacturing, quality, and regulatory in nature. And I'm not going to talk about those. That's the topic for another talk, and maybe, at the Lichen Lecture 30 years from now, I'll come back and tell you about that. What about the consequences? Well, some of my team colleagues may remember that in 2009 there was a shortage of a drug called mechlorethamine. Mechlorethamine was approved by the FDA in 1949. It's been part of Hodgkin lymphoma protocols for over 50 years. And there was a shortage. And the mechlorethamine at the time was used to treat a subset of kids and adolescents and young adults with Hodgkin lymphoma. And so at that time, evidence suggested that cyclophosphamide, another chemotherapeutic, was as effective. So 40 kids out of 181 got the alternative that included cyclophosphamide. Well, the 2-year event-free survival for those kids was 12.5% lower. And while there were no deaths, those kids got exposed to considerably more rounds of toxic chemotherapy, even stem cell transplant. And that prompted the authors of that study to see what you see here in the middle. This was published in New England Journal. Even promising substitute regimens should be examined carefully before adoption. What might appear to be a suitable alternative regimen may result in an inferior outcome. And you can see that here schematically. And it's also important to note that these shortages of chemo, more than any other class of drug, impact patient safety. Suddenly you're giving a drug that you're not familiar with in combination with other drugs, and the toxicities and the side effects. You want more data? Also published in New England Journal. This is a survey of medical or adult oncologists asking them the impact of the shortages over the prior 6 months. And a staggering 83% of the oncologists said that they weren't able to prescribe their preferred chemotherapeutic. Over 3/4 said that they had to make a major change in treatment, such as picking a different protocol or substituting a drug during the course of treatment. And over 40% said they have to delay the start of treatment because of a shortage. So imagine you're told, sorry, Mr. Jones, you have cancer, but oh, I can't start your treatment because I'm missing drug X. Now, what I find really concerning is, even though these shortages have been around for over 10 years, 70% of the respondents said that their hospital or group lacked any type of guidance about how one goes about allocating them. So there's my grant funding right there for the question that I want to get money for, right? Well, what about pediatric data? So this is a study published just last year in Pediatric Blood and Cancer, and it was a study of Children's Oncology Group principal investigators and pharmacists asking them the impact of the shortages over a 2-year period on clinical care and research. And here were the top drugs in short supply. But what I find more interesting was this data. So 50% of the PIs said that at least one kid under their care's research participation was influenced by these shortages, and 2/3 of the PIs said that at least one kid under their care's clinical care was influenced by the shortages. The data from the pharmacist is very telling. 1/3 said that there was a near miss or actual medication error attributed to these shortages. Now, 70% of the adults lacked guidance. The exact opposite was true on the pediatric side, who said that there was center-level guidance in 73%. And the reasons for that are probably because there's far fewer pediatric oncologists, CUG serves as a clearinghouse, but just because there's center-level guidance doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical, and it's certainly not uniform. So this raises a host of ethical issues for us. What are we supposed to do? Do we delay treatment? Do we skip a dose? Do we give a lower dose? Who gets to make that call? Me, you, some independent neutral panel? And if we do prioritize, what is that going to look like? Well, ethicists love to play thought experiments, but unfortunately this isn't a thought experiment. This happens all the time. So let me give you an example. Take methotrexate. We use it to treat ALL, the most common childhood cancer of all, affecting nearly 1/4 of all kids with cancer, and we use it to treat osteosarcoma, the most common bone tumor. So I see some P.Monk fellows back there. Average dose for an adolescent with osteosarcoma, how much methotrexate per cycle? There's candy at stake here. What's the average dose? Bueller? All right, how about an attending? Attending want candy? Yummy Jolly Rancher? No? Okay. You guys gonna, yeah, Dr. Dome.
12 grams.
Okay. Nice job. Good catch. Exactly, 12 grams per meter squared, and we max out at 20 grams. So that same 20 grams to treat one kid with osteosarcoma for one cycle could be used to treat 1,300 to 2,000 kids with ALL who needed methotrexate for CNS prophylaxis. So does that mean that the kid with osteosarcoma's life is worth less than the kid with ALL? I don't know. Maybe we prioritize kids over adults. I think everybody in this room would agree we're all pediatric folk. Well, that's exactly what happened at Sloan Kettering a few years back, where they preferred to divert their limited daunorubicin supply to kids over adults. Maybe first come, first serve is the way we do this. Seems to do away with some of those sticky ethical issues. Now, in a few minutes, you guys are going to talk more. Trust me, you'll talk more, else this talk is going to really get boring. But let me give you one of my beefs about first come, first serve. So the first problem I have with it is information. For better or worse, by virtue of you all being here today, you now have information that somebody who's not here has that's actionable. And you can now know about these shortages, and that may color your decisions and how you can access these drugs. And that doesn't seem like a good way to allocate a drug. Another is something as simple as access. So what I mean by that is, Hella back there can tell you that, you know, I drive like a good Israeli, meaning I'm coming hard and I'm coming fast. Get out of my way. Now, let's say that, you know, Hella drives like a much more tame person, although that's up for debate. Or let's say she has to take the bus to get somewhere. And just because I drive like a maniac and I hear about a shortage doesn't mean that that's the way we want to allocate a scarce drug. But the biggest problem I have with actually first come, first serve is it doesn't take into account need. I'd argue that no two kids are really the same. So that's probably not the way you want to allocate. I gave you examples of the impact of these shortages on clinical care, but also remember the influence that they have on research. So in pediatric oncology, we're very proud of the fact that each decade has seen more and more kids with cancer survive. And the reason for that really is because of research that we do. The same drugs that are in short supply are the backbones of our research protocols. How are we going to continue to make substantive observations without them? Alternative agents, we saw with the metchlorethamine and cyclophosphamide, even when we think they're going to work out, they don't necessarily do that. Now, this notion of coordination, cooperation, Believe it or not, that's the solution to the shortages. And we're not there yet, but I wanted to bring it up. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention the gray market. Has anybody heard of the gray market? Okay, so the gray market are a group of unauthorized secondary drug distributors that profit from the shortages. The average markup of a drug sold on the gray market, 650%. This is why one commentator has called them scalpers in healthcare. But take a look at this data. Here are the top 10 highest markup drugs sold on the gray market, and 3 of the top 4 chemotherapeutics. Ara-C and dexamethasone mark up nearly 4,000%, and leucovorin over 3,000%. Even more consequences. So motivated by work within COG and supported by the Berman Institute at Hopkins, we brought together this group with this very sexy name, the Working Group on Chemotherapy, Drug Shortages, and Pediatric Oncology. And our plan was to come up with agreement on core ethical values and practical actions needed to deal with these shortages by institutions, agencies, and other stakeholders. And here were the kind of workup of our group, and it was a transnational U.S.-Canadian group. And we endorsed 2 core ethical values. We wanted to maximize potential benefits of these highly effective and life-saving drugs, and we wanted to do this fairly. We wanted to make sure that there was equitable access across patients and patient groups. And it became clear to us really early on that the only way to do this effectively was through coordination. And so we came up with 6 recommendations, and the focus was on novel ways to prevent and to mitigate the shortages. We didn't focus on prioritization. And each recommendation had a whole subset of recommendations and barriers and things like that. And if you want to learn more about it, this was published a couple of years ago in Pediatrics. So that's not our focus today. Our focus today is on allocation. So solving the drug shortage problem will ultimately require a major policy shift, one that's grounded in coordination and cooperation. But until that time comes, as a society, we need to be prepared to make the difficult decisions about how we want to divvy up scarce life-saving chemo among equally deserving kids. But prioritization gets a bad rap in some places, especially here in the U.S. And here you see 2 opposing views. One is John Aris, who's a well-known bioethicist who unfortunately passed away just last year, and John favored prioritization. And the second one in the middle is Sarah Palin's now infamous Facebook post, and you can see what she said there. You know, here in the States, prioritization is oftentimes thought of as a 4-letter word. And you say prioritization, what's the next thing that comes out of people's mouths? Rationing. And then it doesn't take long until somebody says death panels. What we need to remember is rationing happens every single day in the U.S. healthcare system. Insurance companies ration all the time when they approve or disapprove of a treatment, a procedure, an intervention. That's a form of what we call in ethics implicit rationing. Another form of implicit rationing is the patient's ability to pay. Explicit rationing is things like allocation of organs, hemodialysis, et cetera. So although rationing may happen all the time in the U.S. healthcare system, being forced to ration life-saving chemo sometimes or somehow feels a little different, and it raises serious concerns. Now, in the heat of the moment, of course, each one of us is going to advocate for our patient at the bedside, but I'd argue that's not the way you want to do it. It's inefficient, it's not comfortable, and it's not ethical. It's very prone to subjective preferences, and the focus, understandably, is on this notion of me and my patient, but that's not the way we want to do this. And this is why some institutions already have prioritization plans in place. Now, we purport to practice evidence-based medicine, so what does the literature tell us about the best way to do this? So on this busy slide, what I've tried to summarize for you is what 4 thoughtful groups say about this. So you can see all 4 agree that the primary benefit really should be the driver, medical need. And you can see that all 4 also agree that we shouldn't just favor the worst off. But after that, it's not so clear-cut. Some say first come, first serve, sure. Some say no way, and probably the most honest are raising their hands. They have no idea. And the same goes for this notion of lottery. And then there's reciprocity. Well, what's meant by reciprocity? So take pediatric oncology. You all know that most of the kids we care for enroll in clinical trials. And one could argue because these people are taking one for the team, they're participating in potentially risky research, contributing to generalizable knowledge, that they are owed something. Another unique question for us in pediatric oncology is, take methotrexate again. Yes, we use it, but we're not the only ones. Rheumatologists use it, some dermatologists use it, GYN doctors use it. Who's to say that the bald little kid with cancer is any more deserving of that scarce methotrexate than these other kids? So if solving the drug shortage problem is going to require a policy shift related to that, it's important to appreciate the difference between personal and public health ethics. Personal or medical ethics, the focus is on the patient-physician relationship. And at least here in the West, that's largely driven by this notion of respect for persons or autonomy. Public health ethics the focus is on the larger population, all of you out there, and here the focus is more on utilitarianism and distributive justice. Okay, so I don't have a lot of faith because so far you guys haven't had enough coffee and caffeine, but now's the time for you guys to speak up. So I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to come up with your own allocation schema, okay? And I'm going to share with you one of the actual cases that our allocation task force used. And let me summarize it for you. You're a pediatric oncologist and you work at a place like this. It's very busy. And so far, you've had adequate drugs. But when you come to clinic this morning, you're told, Dr. Perez, no more vincristine by the end of the week. We're done. And to make matters worse, the chemotherapy pharmacy director tells you the usual places where I've been able to get additional drugs aren't available because the primary supplier has halted production, so there's a national shortage. Now, for those of you who don't do peds hemonc, what you need to understand about vincristine is it's kind of like water. Chances are you walk into the clinic before they made a diagnosis, somebody's writing an order for vincristine because we use it for leukemias, lymphomas, solid tumors, bone tumors, brain tumors. So vincristine shortage would have a far-reaching impact on countless kids with cancer. And that's exactly what you see when you review your census. Now, all the kids are going to need the same milligram per meter squared dose. But because of their different body surface area, their different diseases, their different protocols, some are going to get higher doses, some are going to get lower doses, some are going to get it more frequently, some are going to get it less frequently. And because I'm a bioethicist and I like to make things difficult, to make things more difficult, some of the kids are getting the vincristine as part of standard of care, and some of them are getting it as part of a research protocol. So smart, wise, active people. My question for you is, how do you want to allocate this? And this is you guys in the middle. And here's your dilemma, right? This was recognized almost 50 years ago and published in a major journal. So because you guys, I can see, are a little bit shy, we're going to play a warm-up game that I call Name That Drill Instructor. Now, Dr. Silber told you that I was a drill instructor back in the day. So I'm going to show you a picture of a Hollywood drill instructor. And if you can tell me his name, and these are all guys, his name or the movie or the year, you'll get a fancy Jolly Rancher. So let's start. Does anybody recognize this dude or the movie? Oh, who said Full Metal Jacket? Nice job. That's R. Lee Ermey in Full Metal Jacket. There you go. Nice, 1987. Anybody recognize this? Louis Gossett Jr. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. What movie was that? Officer and a Gentleman. Okay, we had one here, and where was that? Okay. I hope my endocrine colleagues don't get mad at me for, perpetuating hyperglycemia here. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think I get to keep the Jolly Ranchers. That's Warren Oates, Sergeant Hulka in Stripes, 1981. How about this? Now it's getting hard. No. That's Viggo Mortensen from G.I. Jane in 1997. How about that? That's me. Who said that? Marjorie, nice. That was 1986 to 89 in the IDF. I don't know. There's something there that maybe it's the sunglasses. All right, so with that in mind, let me take you back to the case. So you got vincristine, you're going to be out by the end of the week, and I want to spend about 5 minutes, if possible, and just raise your hand and shout it out. You don't even have to raise your hand, shout it out. How do you want it, what criteria, how do you want to distribute? Think about how you want to give the vincristine. You've got all these kids who need it, and you don't have enough. So, who's the first brave soul? Yes? The question was, is the research study still going on? Indeed it is, yes. Okay, so the response was prioritize to the kids in research because that way you won't jeopardize losing your data. And thank you for justifying. Ethicists are all about, anybody can say anything, anything's reasonable, but you have to justify why you think your action is the appropriate one. Okay, so we're going to prioritize to research. Sir?
That point with the counter, that I'm redoing my CITI certification on bioethics. Now you're using coercion to get people into the study because they know they might not get it.
Dr. Silber's smiling down here as a research subject advocate. Look at this. There's dissension in the ranks already. Yeah. So what the gentleman was saying was that now your carrot is a bit of an arm twist. It's like, ooh, come sign up on this research study, and we'll give you the drug. Well, okay, good. We'll talk some more. Fidelio.
So availability of alternative regimens. Are there some patients that effective equally?
Great answer. So there may be an alternative, right? Instead of maybe using, daunorubicin, you could use doxorubicin or something like that, or some other regimen. It may not be as your first priority, but great answer. This side of the room's killing it. This side of the room is just... Dr. Packer says evidence-based. What do you mean by that? So that would say necessarily that you don't focus on the research protocol, that you don't distribute over there, right? Because it hasn't been proven yet. Okay, so distribute strictly based on where you've got data. Okay, good. Yes?
So is a non-caregiver?
Okay, so triage, the kid who needs it the most. Okay, we're going to go over here, and then we're coming over here.
So how about this? If you have conditions where it's 90% survival and conditions where there's less than 20% survival, A or C chances of best survival.
Okay, so focusing on curability. Okay, good. Oh, and I realize I'm not doing my job. So, yeah. Okay, so focus on the amount of drug that people need. Okay? Dr. Packer, watch your head. Who'd I miss? You get two. Okay. Anybody else? I got a lot of candy. I'm not taking it back to my kids.
You can also look at this, whether the sequence matters. Like, so if you substitute another drug now and then give the scarce one later, or maybe more.
Did everybody hear, Dr. Dome, that you take it out of order if possible, so and you get one by proxy. So in other words, maybe you can give a drug instead of do it at week 2, you give it at week 4, or, okay. Yes, in the back.
Number of rounds of chemo, can you decrease rounds or how someone's scans are looking?
So give fewer. All right, I'm going to take somebody out with this one. Nice. Okay, so give potentially fewer doses.
The ones that are at the very end of the cycle. Therapy.
Meaning what? You would spare them in a negative way?
So you finish off their therapy because it's always done with their treatment.
Okay. So focus on the ones that you started treating already. Okay. Good. So.
Along with this, would there be a macro effort to lobby pharmaceuticals?
Okay. And Dr. Packer's getting up at that point. He's like, I'm done. Good to see you. So, I mean, that's one of the solutions, right? And this is, you're stealing my thunder, but it's totally appropriate. I mean, everything we're talking about today is a tragic choice, right? Why are we even in this situation? That's the solution, and we'll allude to that a little bit. Okay, yeah, we're going to take one more, and then I just want to make sure that there's time at the end for. Okay, so I have a special place in my heart for pharmacists because I share a bed at home with one, and so you get my favorite color for Jolly Ranchers, green. Yes. Okay, so you guys came up with a lot of great answers, and I think we can all agree that when it comes to allocation, prioritization decisions should be justified based on sound and reasonable ethical guidance, right? Now, there's lots of different criteria out there, and you guys hit on a lot of them. Some of the more accepted models that people talk about when having to allocate a scarce resource are things like allocating based on randomness. Now, I'd argue first come, first serve is not truly random for some of the reasons I spoke about. Truly random is drawing straws, right? There's nothing to it. Another model is need-based models, where you prioritize the sickest first, or you focus on medical criteria. What's the urgency of the situation? How likely is giving a drug to that kid going to help them? How long will that benefit last? Factors like that. What's the quality of that benefit? Some people talk about this notion of socio-medical, in other words, factors that are thought to improve or maximize the outcome of giving a drug to somebody. So if all else being equal, if you have a kid with one problem versus an elderly person who's got 10 problems, you give it to the kid because they're not going to have as many issues. Or somebody who's got a support system who can get them to their appointments, or who's committed to their regimen, who's going to take it, right? Think about the transplant scenario there. Some people talk about personal criteria. You know, can the person pay? Is the person committed to it? You see that in the literature. This next one is particularly intriguing, though, this notion of social value. And this is where this notion of reciprocity comes in. So an example of that would be you have a 32-year-old single mother of two who's an Iraq war veteran. And, I mean, she's contributed, and she's got people who are dependent on her. Maybe you prioritize to her, or maybe it's to the kid whose wealthy parents say, if you give it to Johnny, we'll donate $25 million so you can build that new hospital, and think how many thousands of kids you'll be able to help. Starting to get tough, huh? This one's particularly intriguing. This is a model advocated by Daniels and Sabin. It's called the accountability for reasonableness model. And here, decisions are based on these four criteria. So what's meant by relevance is that decisions for limit setting should be reasoned and based upon evidence, values, and principles as agreed upon by fair-minded people. I mean, right? I consider myself fair-minded. I think some of the people running for office now probably think they're fair-minded. I don't know if we'd all agree, but, you know, that's another issue. Publicity means that the rationale for decisions should be accessible and transparent. Revisions and appeals means that anybody should be able to challenge a decision that doesn't go in their favor, and if there's new data, you can change your initial allocation decision. And then regulative means that a body needs to be able to uphold the first three. And here's what Daniels and Sabin think about their model. And it's close. Phil Rossoff at Duke, who's a pediatric oncologist and bioethicist, has done a lot of work on allocation, and he adds a fifth criteria, this notion of fairness. In other words, don't game the system. The son of the doctor, the CEO, the head counsel of the hospital gets no priority over other people. Now, I don't expect you to be able to see this. It's not a Snell and I chart. But what it is it's a summary of some of these models. And really the take-home is you could certainly allocate according to any one of them, but on their own, they have strengths and weaknesses and are insufficient. And you could try to do an amalgam. You could try to combine one, but that's not going to prove very practical. So motivated by that, we convened a smaller subcommittee of our initial working group, and we called ourselves the ATF, the Allocation Task Force. Probably not a great acronym. You know, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. I wasn't thinking about it when I came up with that one, but it's too late now. And you can see who was in our group. Okay, we had clinicians of all flavors, and this was a COG effort. And we wanted to make sure that we did this right, and so we scoured the literature. We read about how people in transplant allocate, and we read about how people in ICU beds allocate and flu and things like that. And we wanted to be clinically applicable. So we did case-based discussions. We came up with cases, and I showed you one of them already. And we came up with this two-tiered process based on mitigation and prioritization. Now, this next point is critical. Bedside decision-making, I told you, is not the way you want to allocate. It doesn't matter how smart of a clinician you are. These are really weighty, difficult decisions, and they need to be made by a multidisciplinary group of people that has broad stakeholders, clinicians, so docs and nurses and pharmacists, psychosocial people, patient advocates, okay? And we came up with agreement on a framework which provides concrete guidance for actual decision-making when you're forced to ration. And then what we did was we had some revisions within our group, and we sent it out to an independent panel of people who weren't related to us, and they chewed it up. And then we revised it again. I think we went through, I mean, I've worked with colleagues on other projects before. We've never had as many internal revisions, or I've never had. We had 10 internal revisions. And then we finally got endorsed by COG and the American Society of Peds Hemonc. And we just published this earlier this year at the end of January, so you can read about it here. So what was our process? Our process was mitigation, maximizing efficiency and minimizing waste, and prioritization. And here the focus, as you can see, was on maximizing benefit according to total lives saved or life years saved. So Mitigation, right? Tightening the belt. It makes perfect sense. Think about the water shortage in California. You stop watering every day. You stop planting lawns. Instead, you do a rock garden. Okay? Same thing happens with the drug shortage. Now, in order to do that, think about the people who are involved in drugs. It's not just your patient and you. It's your friendly neighborhood pharmacist. It's the drug manufacturer and distributor. Having everybody on the same page to have information about how you want to mitigate is critical. And right now, it's not that clear cut. So that's the first step. A few general considerations. So all drug shortages, we argue, should be viewed as national emergencies or natural disasters. And the reason for that is simple. It allows for remediation and even policy change. So I'll give you an example. In 2013, the ID folks here may recall that there was an outbreak of bacterial meningitis caused by strain B. And that wasn't covered in the U.S. vaccine at the time. So CDC and FDA got together and allowed to import a Swiss vaccine that covered it. That's policy change. That's remediation. That's important. Hospitals shouldn't hoard drugs. I mean, it sounds so simple. But at least up the road in Baltimore, when there's a mention of a snowstorm, what happens if you're a local Giant and Safeway? Oh, my God. There's a run on toilet paper and batteries, or in the Unguru household, coffee and hot sauce, right? And hospitals are no different when it comes to drugs. We know there's data. 85% of hospitals purchase excess inventory in response to shortages. So I sit on my hospital's drug shortage committee. I thought my badge got me into every room in the hospital. It doesn't get me into this room. It's like that old Get Smart, you know, the door's open and you pick up your foot and you do this, and I know I'm dating myself. It's the most secure room in the hospital, and the walls of our meeting room are lined by boxes of drugs that are in short supply. Everybody hoards, okay? Everybody. We shouldn't delay or interrupt peaceful treatment. Again, it seems obvious, but you can imagine the optics of if word gets out, Child to Children's didn't get drugged, you know, the people are going to say, ooh, just hold on to them, wait another, week, another 2 weeks, something will happen. We need to make sure that the drugs are listed where they are, the ASHP and FDA website. And believe it or not, they don't always have the most up-to-date information, okay? Knowing what the supply is and how long it's going to last is going to allow you to prepare. If you know that the shortage is going to be 2 weeks versus 6 months versus no idea, you'll plan differently. And that's really important to know, not just for your current patients, but for your expectant patients. I was talking to some of your colleagues here earlier, and they told me that the peds-onc people are now getting on the order of 300 new kids with diagnoses each year. So you know you're going to get 40 kids with ALL. Well, you better plan for getting high-priority drugs like leucovorin, asparaginase, because you know you're going to get those kids. You have to plan accordingly. Number 4 is interesting. So hospitals tend to order the same things because that's what they do. You know, you order a 50-milligram vial of methotrexate. Well, if that vial is in short supply, believe it or not, in many other countries, they produce other size vials. The problem is here in the United States, because of our market system, they oftentimes don't, but that's another issue. But maybe you get a different vial size. Hospitals do this all the time. So if you have that 50-milligram vial that's meant for single use and you only need 12 milligrams, what do you do with the rest? You waste it. Well, you don't waste it. You bring kids, 2 or 3 other kids who are going to need that drug so you can share it. Maybe, this is Avelio's point, you select an alternative drug if it's available. Not always available, unfortunately not enough, but sometimes it might be. And this notion of borrowing and sharing, that's one of the solutions to the shortage. You coordinate. So because of the varied distribution of drugs nationally here in the U.S., shortages happen at different times, at different places, and at different rates across the country. So an example is in 2011, 13 states, including Maryland, had more shortages than others. Well, Virginia didn't, so maybe you beg, borrow, and plead. Unfortunately, there's a lot of laws that prevent transfer of drugs across state lines, and that's something we've been working on. This goes to Dr. Doan's point. You give, out of sequence or a lower dose or skip a dose. Some places are very fortunate and will never experience a shortage. I don't think St. Jude will ever experience a shortage because they can make their own drugs. Duke, to a lesser degree, has the ability to do that. Most of us aren't that fortunate. All else fails, FDA can get us drugs sometimes from overseas, and they've done this for methotrexate and leucovorin, liposomal doxorubicin, and et cetera, et cetera. And then we need to think outside the box. We need to maybe think about this notion of using a drug that's not so stable or expired. I mean, everybody in this room has walked to the refrigerator at 12:01 and gotten that jug of milk, and it said, oh, expired yesterday. And in your head, you're like, huh. Some of you may go, yeah, what the hell? And you drink it, and nothing happens. You know, what's magical about that drug expiring? Again, this is a natural emergency. We need to be willing to think outside the box. Now, there's a lot of legal ramifications and a lot of risk ramifications, but this is as Arnold Schwarzenegger said in the movie Twins, it's a crisis situation, okay? What about actual allocation? Well, when we're doing allocation, we need to be reasoned, we need to be explicit, we need to be transparent, and we need to be public. Why? Because that way we'll gain the public's trust that our decisions are not just willy-nilly, but that there's some nuance there. Think about the insulin and penicillin and dialysis machine examples I gave you before. How everybody was so angry because, well, how did you guys come about these decisions, right? And the model that we use is this notion, essentially, saving more lives is better than not. And this is a model that's been used in these other examples that I show you here. So we should not allocate based on age, gender, size. That means that the kid with a BSA of 0.5 or 1, you don't view them differently. Socioeconomic status, immigration status, et cetera. We don't recommend allocating based on those criteria. The notion of curability came up, right? So we need to remember that these shortages compromise the standard of care. Kids are not going to have the same outcomes that they would otherwise, and therefore we're faced with this tragic situation. And we don't like to think about it as pediatricians, but one of our recommendations is that we do focus on what we call a threshold of curability. So you've got a kid with an 80% chance of cure and a 40% chance of cure, maybe you give the drug to the kid with the 80%. Now, oftentimes we don't have these big margins, and we are very clear that we should not use this threshold when it comes to narrower margins. But we don't give any guidance as far as where a cutoff is, and that's one of the downsides of this particular recommendation, but it's something that we should consider, okay? Allocation decisions really need to be based on the data. Again, you guys came up with this. So take methotrexate. I told you we use it for ALL and osteosarcoma. So many European protocols for osteosarcoma don't include methotrexate, and their outcomes are no different than ours. So one of our recommendations is the next time there's a methotrexate shortage, it not be given to kids with osteosarcoma, be given to kids with ALL. By the same token, you should not prioritize drugs that have yet to be proven to be effective. It doesn't matter how promising they are. The data's simply not there. Focus on where the money is. We need to think about how important a drug is to a given kid's prognosis. So germ cell tumors, cisplatin, really important. Cisplatin's not as important in some other diseases. By the flip side of that, and this goes to the gentleman in the pink back there, what he mentioned, a kid with average risk, very low ALL probably doesn't need as much of incristin, especially towards the end of their therapy, right? So you can divert that way. Now, one of our concerns is that people are going to think about, oh, I got to divert drug to the kid who's more curable, the kid who's more curable. There are some kids who have bad disease, and that drug is their only chance of beating the disease. An example here is prioritizing doxorubicin for sarcomas over doxorubicin for Hodgkin lymphoma. So that's one of our recommendations in that regard. The total amount of the scarce drug required, you all mentioned this. So take Wilms tumor, very low risk, and high risk rhabdo. Both of them get actinomycin. The kid with Wilms tumor needs very little, and it's a highly curable disease. The kid with rhabdo needs a lot of it, and it's a very difficult disease. Again, these are not easy decisions to make. The phase of therapy. I'd argue that a kid with an induction with ALL who has a large disease burden probably needs the peg asparaginase and the vincristine more than that same kid does at the end of their therapy. Now, this may seem counterintuitive from a group of pediatric oncologists, but we do not recommend prioritizing to clinical trial participants. And part of the reason was what these two were about to go to fisticuffs about, this notion of, I got my money on her. This notion of undue inducement or coercion, public perception, child on research trial, given drug over child who didn't participate, and really focusing on the data. And then the most obvious, but it doesn't get enough mileage, is we have to involve people who have skin in the game more. It's very easy for me in my ivory tower to sit up there, although I am a clinician, that's what I do day to day. But it's still very easy for me to wax poetic about this and give you this list of things. We have to include the parents and the kids who are involved in these decisions. And this is just a kind of tabular summary with some of the examples of what I just spoke about. So to conclude, like it or not, shortages are here to stay. They've been here before, they're here now, and unfortunately they're not going anywhere. And I showed you that data in the beginning. And like it or not, healthcare rationing already happens. Now we know from data that doctors and clinicians lack guidance on how to do this. So until there can be some way to prevent the shortages, right, until there can be a national policy advisory statement on how to allocate, we think ours is one of those, we need to be prepared to make decisions about how you want to allocate these scarce drugs. And so we think that our work is semi-thoughtful, hopefully, nuanced enough, defensible, and it gives concrete actions for how you want to actually allocate. And although our recommendations are specifically for pediatric oncology, we think that they apply more broadly the principles to other shortages. And so on that, I will leave you with this little caricature. And one of my daughters said, you know what, that looks like you, Daddy. And it says, generic drug shortages, we're looking for a new supplier. And I think we've still got about 10 minutes for questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of food for thought in a room where we're not allowed food, in fact. I understand that you would not prioritize according to socioeconomic status and so forth and so on. But can you defend the idea of not prioritizing by age? Because when you look at age, you're looking at potential productivity, quality of life years, and so forth.
I'm assuming everybody heard the question, so I don't need to repeat it, right? Why don't you focus on age? So I'll give you the cynical, snarky answer, and then I'll give you a little more nuanced. So the cynical, snarky answer is we're pediatricians, and this was a children's oncology group effort. And our argument was, and that's the kind of cynical, snarky, but the foundation for that is our assumption is since most kids with cancer can be cured of their disease, doesn't matter if the kid's 2 or 12, they still have a very long life ahead of them. And you bring up an important point, this notion of quality-adjusted life years, disability-adjusted life years, QALYs and DALYs, and health economists use this all the time when they try to, put on their thinking hat in terms of some of these ethical issues. And so our focus really is on kids, and we don't think that there's much of a difference in that regard. Now, I will tell you, I'm part of there's one thoughtful drug company out there, and I'm sure they had other motivations, but they brought together a group of childhood and adult oncologists to explore how they would allocate a particular drug that is used by both adult and cancer patients. And that's a very interesting discussion that we've had because now I'm forced to think about the adults. And I can tell you that my adult colleagues on that panel are thinking of an age limit when it comes to their patients. But they certainly wouldn't advocate prioritizing to kids over adults, and I don't know how many of us would if it was us or a family member who needed the drug.
Your last slide referred to the fact that drug shortages are inevitable. So in an era where I regret to say after 20-some years of people talking about patient and family-centered care, there are still many, many instances where people feel there is not shared decision-making or, enough information to be involved. What would you suggest if it's inevitable? Is that something that should be the beginning of every new interaction between a patient and family caregivers and an oncologist, that it might happen?
So I think that's a wonderful recommendation. I think a lot of us would struggle in how to broach that because, as you know, that initial interaction is a very charged one. There's a lot going on. I mean, we know from data, Rick Kodish's work, including that he did here as one of the sites, this notion of all parents are hearing is, oh my God, my kid has cancer. Everything else is secondary. So I think that should should enter the equation. I can tell you that I've had very savvy patients who have said, you know what, I don't like this research protocol, but I think I'm going to enroll on it because I think I'll have a better chance of getting the drug. That's a discussion that needs to happen. But really, the issue here is this is our problem. We own this. This has a USA rubber stamp on it. Shortages happen in other countries, but not nearly as many and not nearly to the same degree. And other countries are allowed to negotiate with drug companies. They can set prices. The economic drivers are huge here. The business decisions are huge. The consolidation within the pharmaceutical marketplace are massive. And these are the real issues. So, I mean, again, that's the focus of another talk, but that's really, I think, the talk that needs to happen. Our patients, our professional organizations need to be more involved in this. I mean, people don't know about this. You know, 200 drugs in short supply, are you kidding me? I mean, it's really bizarre.
You just alluded to this a little bit about 30 seconds ago, but it seems to me in the last 15 years of my practice, there seem to be a lot more drug shortages than in the first 15 years of my practice. And I guess the question is, what are the reasons for it? Are they primarily economic? Are they primarily profit-driven? If a drug is old and not making much money, they don't want to make it. How does this work? And are there potential regulatory solutions to that?
And what kind of medicine do you do?
Critical care, pediatric cardiac.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Care.
I mean, you saw that slide I showed. You guys are at the top of the list, the critical care drugs. So, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. I showed a pie chart of some of the causes and then flew right over it. The economic drivers are massive. The way that drugs since 2004 have been reimbursed, for Medicare especially, is based on this antiquated formula called average sales price plus 6%. So drug companies invest a lot of money in producing a drug, and then they don't get a lot of bang on their buck. There's been a consolidation in this marketplace, so there's only one or two companies often that produce these life-saving drugs, and if they decide because of a business decision or if they have a quality problem, think about the New England compounding company that had the solumedrol problem, if they, for any reason, decide to shut down, we suddenly get a shortage that can last 6 months or more. The drug companies, we in the U.S. are not allowed by law to negotiate with drug companies. Other countries are. So the drug companies, what they do is, and drug companies serve an important role. I'm not trying to bash them. In fact, I'm giving this talk at a drug company meeting next month, and I'm terrified. I mean, I think I need to go back and train a little bit because I think I'm going to get lynched. But so the drug companies have stated in internal documents. Is there anybody here from a drug company? That they make up their margins in the U.S. based on the lower prices elsewhere. The amount of money that cancer drugs, biologics, all these things generate are huge. And so, we are a market-driven healthcare system, and that is a huge, huge problem. That's why this is our problem. And there's a lot of other issues. I'm happy to talk some more about it.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
If I could just thank you very much. I think that was a terrific talk.
Thank you.
Can you speak to whether there can be an algorithm developed out of what you've spoken of that would make it easier for folks to walk through the process, yes, no, and to make a final decision?
So in that paper that we just published earlier this year in JNCI, there is an algorithm that does kind of do that. The next step, what I've been asked by the chair of COG to do is to make that even more granular. But we do provide an actual, what we tried to do was, it's specific to peds oncology, right? And so the examples that we use are pediatric oncology examples. So methotrexate, you give it to kids with ALL versus osteosarcoma, things like that. But the principles can be applied to the ICU, to metabolic diseases, to whatever. The problem is people don't like to make these decisions, right? The thing that I failed to mention is these are all finger in the dike. It's ridiculous that we need to make these types of decisions. I mean, this is not the solution. Our allocation model, the best allocation model in the world, be it somebody else's, is not the solution. The solution is to avoid these, prevent these from happening. But if you take a look at it, I think you will see that there are some stepwise stuff. And it's by no means the best. It's what we came up with, and after the 40th revision, I said, I'm done. We have to sign off on this. And so, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I just would like to make an announcement, and that is we will have, following this, in the auditorium, a meeting of family services with Yoram for dialogue with the ethicist, and then at 11 o'clock in the morning, we will have psychiatric rounds where he'll be the guest speaker relating to the rejection of adolescents of proposed cancer treatment. Then
that's a fun talk. That is a fun talk.
And then in the afternoon, he's going to meet with our ethics committee to discuss our cases. And then finally, later on in the day, he will be meeting with the Division of Hematology Oncology, following the tradition that every year we have the Liking Lecture meeting with a division. And so the big question is it ethical to exploit an ethicist? Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.